Welcome to the 2 o'clock session on Wednesday at AltConf. Next up, we have Paul Goracke, who's going to tell us all about dynamic type.
Thank you. So I've been trying to talk about dynamic type for quite a while now and trying to get across, and so it's been kind of nerve-wracking. It's been encouraging yet nerve-wracking that this seems to be the WWDC that Apple is really starting to talk about it more, because I'm feeling the pressure. So hopefully this will help you start getting going on the apps that you have available now. Low vision. We all kind of have a good idea of 20/20 vision and what that looks like. And we also have a pretty good idea of what it is to be blind and work with a screen curtain. Has everybody dealt with voiceover demonstrations for actually navigating those before? There's lots of talks about it, that kind of accessibility, and it kind of makes this whole bimodal attitude of it's either nice and crisp or it's nothing at all. But there's this whole range in between of low vision and the spectrum. So as you probably hopefully remember from science class, your eyeball looks exactly like that. And when you're trying to look at something, the light from that object goes through your cornea and your pupil and lens and focuses on the back of your eye on the retina, which is what we translated into an actual image. And when we can adjust for close-up vision as well, everything works fine and it goes onto the back and hits the retina fine and everything looks in focus. There are many ways that people can have vision problems, and there's trauma, there's disease, and I'm not really dealing with that right now and talking about it, but I was kind of wanting to address the refractive issues. Basically, the general issues with the lens or cornea or even the shape of the eyeball that makes it so people need correction, that they can't see things in focus properly. There is myopia, nearsightedness, which affects 42% of Americans, and I'm going to apologize ahead for anybody international that these numbers are American, but they were about the most consistent set of numbers I could find. In that, the image is focused actually ahead of the retina, and so distant objects are unfocused and near objects are fine. Then there's actually hyperopia, which is farsightedness, where you can see things distantly fine, but up close you can't. They're all out of focus because it's actually focusing behind the retina. Then there's, and that affects only about 5 to 10% of Americans. Okay. And then there's astigmatism, which I've never really understood because nobody's really talked to me about it before, but it's basically a combination of focuses, where some parts of the image is focused behind the retina, some is focused in front, and it makes for a kind of a swirly vision in certain ways that I'm not going to try and demonstrate with just a simple apple. As you can probably guess, well, that's 28% of Americans. As you can probably guess, the farsightedness is pretty much the one that we care about as far as iOS devices, because this is the focus range. If they can see out that far, we might care about it for Apple TV, but we don't care about it for iPhones and iPads so much. It's not really affecting that so much. So, then there's presbyopia. Sorry. Which is a hardening of the lens, a stiffening of the lens. So when your eye tries to change from focusing from something distant to near, it can't quite get the lens to adjust the way it needs to focus properly, and ends up focusing behind the retina, which again is a form of farsightedness. Now, the interesting thing about this is, to some extent, 100% of not only Americans, everyone will be affected by this. Starting around age 40, it's a natural part of aging that your lens starts stiffening up, and you're going to start needing corrective lenses. Some people actually affected see it at about age 35. Most people, I think, probably actually admit to it a couple years after they really need it. We live in denial for a while, and we curse the instructions, the directions, the recipes as being just poorly printed. And interestingly enough, presbyopia is literally Greek for old sight. So if you have not experienced it, you will. And yesterday there was a diversity topic that went into accessibility, and they kept saying, 20 years from now, I'm going to need this. And you don't have 20 years. There might be a few of you in the audience who have 20 years, but most of us don't. So when you look at this, you look at the concept of 20/20 vision, of being able to focus far and near and have it perfectly focused on this little area of your retina, this nice, perfect distance. And I end up concluding that 20/20 vision is pretty much an aberration. Even if you have it right now, you will not. You will eventually lose it to some extent. And as I said, starting at age 40, this kicks in. Last year, or not last year, last week, it's kicking in already. Last week I turned 50, so I've got some recent experience with this, and I'd kind of like to share it with you. When I first started talking about dynamic type, it was actually 2015, I think. I want to say 14, but I can't find evidence of it. And dynamic type was introduced with iOS 7 and TextKit. And to actually support it really well, it was kind of a pain in the butt. If you just wanted to use Apple's fonts and you didn't need it changing, so the user would go and change the preference and come back, you could do it, but pretty much nobody did. And over the years, they've gotten easier and easier. When I first started talking about it, well, I found this eye chart online, which is a little estimate thing of you print it out so they know what size the text is. You're supposed to hold it 12 to 14 inches in front of your face and read down the lines until you find the one that's comfortable for you. And then that tells you what power, what diopter that you would go to a Walgreens or something and get that strength of reading glasses. I measured it out. The very first one on the scale is a 1.0 diopter, and that is 5-point type. And then it gradually gets bigger, 6-point, on up to 3.25 on this sheet. 4 is about the highest power that you can get over the counter usually. After that, they would say, you should really talk to your eye doctor. When I first started doing this talk, I had just gotten reading glasses, so I was at a 1.0. And 4 years later, I'm now wearing a 2.5. And I don't know where this is going to stop. I mean, it always stops at some point. It's not one of those, we're all going to degrade to being blind. We're just going to need corrective lenses for the rest of our lives. But what's interesting to me is within 4 years of doing this talk, I need text that is twice as large, more than twice as large as I did in order to read it comfortably. So that's the kind of effects that you see in the lifetime of working on these apps. So in the range of low vision, I'm not kidding myself that woe is me. This is horribly annoying for me. Wearing reading glasses is annoying, putting them on, because I don't need them to see you guys. Generally, I need them to see my screen, to know what's coming up, which is why I now have this massive, ugly rig. So I can actually make things big enough to see what's coming up without having to put my glasses on and off. But it affects me wearing my watch, because there's really no chance of me reading this very well. Generally, I look and there's a green blob, and I should get my phone out and put my glasses on to read a text message. So it is a pain, but I know that I'm really early in the spectrum, and that there are so many more people who have it regularly more troublesome than I do. So this has become kind of a personal thing for me. Vision impairment, some numbers globally, the World Health Organization estimates that as far as distance vision, so it's not really affecting us with iPhones so much, but there are 188.5 million people with mild impairment. 277 million of them have severe impairment, and 36 million of them are actually blind. When it comes to near vision, the stuff that really kind of matters for us and our iOS apps, 826 million people live with some impairment. So even if you look at it and say, well, it's 2% of the people or something right now, that percentage of the people is always churning and growing with new people. It's your parents, your grandparents, it will be you. So Apple came up with dynamic type. What is dynamic type? Has anybody really tried to search for it? It's fun. Not even Xcode really knows what it is when you try searching. You mostly find things about language features. It is a total pain because it's a kind of umbrella term for a concept that involves UI content size category, UI font text styles, and UI font metrics. So it has nothing to do with dynamic type. There's no match going on, which makes it very frustrating for people trying to support it. To enable it, a user, or if you want to even try it right now, you go into your settings app, into general, accessibility, and then larger text. And there's a slider down there to change. By default, we all start in the middle, which you can actually make text smaller. You can actually make text larger. And set that setting. Now, this is a system-wide setting, and that's kind of the overall goal I want you to think of when it comes to dynamic type is the user is saying right here, this is the size of text I want to have consistently across my apps. And the only way that's going to happen is if your app supports this. Okay, it's not, when dynamic type first came out, a lot of developers took it to mean, well, we're gonna give the user the option of changing their font, their font size from what we say it should be, which generally is too small. But again, the consistency. So changing these sliders changes these constants, these values within the app. And we start at extra small, small, medium. Large is the default that everybody starts at, which is kind of hard to remember. But otherwise, it's just XL, XXL, and XXL. So it's all kind of t-shirt sized. So back to where we set it. There are other ways to set this. Apple has somehow found this so important that they've made many different ways to change it, which is kind of surprising. And I haven't even looked at the new sessions yet, but apparently accessibility is now at the top, right, for 13. So they're really pushing it forward. If you go to the display and brightness in the settings, there's a text size option that allows you to slide that. You will not find this setting on the simulator, which is interesting. And you cannot change, turn on larger text, the accessibility sizes that I'll get to later. You can only use them if you set it in effectively the core settings panel from before. It looks exactly like the other one, only not as functional. As of iOS 11, you can also add it to your control center. You go into Control Center and adjust them, and you can just add the text size item to it and widget and move that around. And then when you bring up your Control Center, you can tap the sizable A's there and use the nice HomeKit slider control to change it. That is actually one of the only places where it will tell you that you've selected a default size if you're trying to experiment with it. But it's kind of nice sometimes when you don't have your glasses nearby and you need to adjust something to figure it out. The larger accessibility sizes, that is a very confusing switch. And what that does is it adds 5 more steps on to the options. This slider right now is actually what was the top of the previous 7, the XXL. So you can add, you can expand beyond that. And there are other kind of features that enables as well that we'll get to later. So this just adds new options. I kind of hid these from you before, but the 5 different ones are the accessibility medium, large, extra large, XXL, XXL, you get the idea, but they all start with accessibility. So those are the settings when it comes to the content size category. Then there's the UI font text style that Apple wants you to choose from. The joy on this is they don't give you much guidance on how to choose them. And how do you decide between caption 1 and caption 2? I don't know. I don't actually have good guidance with this yet. I haven't really experimented with it. I mainly just stick with like headline, subheadline, body, and title, whichever title you want to figure out. But what happens, how this works is you in Xcode, you set the text style for a text element, whether it's a UI label, a text view, or a text field. Those are the three that support it right now. And this is just a sub listing of what you have the option for, and let's choose headline. We build the app, we ship the app, the user gets the app, they got a new phone. So they should technically have a full range of options for the size category to choose from, but it defaults to large. So that headline label will be San Francisco semi-bold 17 point. And you can check this in code if you want with the UiFont preferred font, which is the preferred is relating to the dynamic type stuff now. So for the text style headline and compatible with trait collection with large content size category. Now I come along and I'm using the XXL, and that app launches up and it's setting the fonts and it chooses 23 point semi-bold. So the headline combined with the XXL is what gives me those different things. Again, you choose the text style, the user chooses the content size category. There is actually no way that I know of for you programmatically to change the content size category, except for kind of generating fonts on the fly, if you wish. How the font sizes behave as you go. Right in the middle here we have large, where they all set up. I've resorted these. Before they've all been alphabetical, but now they're by size. The one kind of quirk here is body and headline. You actually you won't see a black line right now because they track each other perfectly. The difference is that headline is a bold and body is not. But they all start out in a kind of standard way, and then as you move smaller, they all pretty consistently go down to 1 point each step. None of them get smaller than 12 point because basically, my strong opinion is that text below 12 point is decoration, it's not information. It's generally a blur. So that's where it's going to stay. And then they all kind of creep up at the same, I think, 2 or 3 points per step. Now, there's the larger accessibility sizes, which prior to iOS 11, the only one that changed was the body. Everything else stayed constant. And I think a lot of developers who were trying to support dynamic type at the time said, hey, if I don't use body, I know what my maximum size that I need support is. So they either didn't support it and just kind of calculated out the maximum area they needed to move things around in, or they didn't support it in general. But the body was intended to be for longer form reading so that a user with really low vision could get that core content of your app and be able to see it. As of 11, though, they changed it, and everything scales, which definitely threw a lot of people off that were supporting it. So how do you enable it in your apps? In Interface Builder, you change the font to a semantic style. By choosing the font and going down to the text styles, you just choose which of the text styles you want to support, and there you go. You can also do this in code, similarly to the code I just showed you as preferred font. So if you actually want to write stuff up in your view did load all the time, go ahead. There is the preferred font for text style compatible with trait collection, other than the demo I gave you to say, go ahead and check that this is the font you get. I haven't found reasons to use it in an app, but if you do, let me know. So then you need to set your text area, your text element to resize properly. With the UI label, you want to adjust the lines because by default it's only going to limit it to 1 line and it'll truncate, and this we don't want anymore. So you adjust it down to 0 because that makes perfect sense. So if you're not familiar with it, setting the number of lines on a text, on a UI label to 0 means that it will actually expand to the number of lines that fit the text you give it. Then you want to go up and go to the dynamic type checkbox where it says automatically adjust, and check that. So the 3 steps that we've got here are you set it to actually say, here's the text style I want to use. You set whatever your text element needs to be to enlarge itself and size to fit with an intrinsic size, content size. And also you want it to be able to adjust if the user adjusts. Theoretically, the user shouldn't be adjusting this much during the lifetime of your app. But if they do decide to and come back to it, it's one of the kind of annoying parts of the code before was that you would have to update every one of your text elements to do that if they did change it, where this saves you a lot of code if you want to support that. In code, you can set adjust font for content size category to true if you don't want to use IB. That works. Now comes the sizing concepts. Basically, you're going to constrain your text elements width in some way, shape, or form. It's either going to be the width of the screen, it's going to be width from an image, whatever. But that's what you're giving it, and then it says, okay, my font is going to be this big, I need this many lines for that text content. So you want to use the intrinsic height of the text field, or text element. You don't ever want to actually constrain the height. You don't really want to be bothering with calculating it yourself either. So the vertical position is one constraint that you want to do, whether it's up to a top margin, whether it's to another element, the left or leading, and the trailing. Now, the trailing, a lot of times I see people dealing with the greater than or equal than because it's only, that way it sizes to fit. And generally, if I know that my fields are going to expand out to the edge, I choose it to equal, and I say, here, I'm taking up this much space. So that I know exactly where it's going to go. I don't have to worry about something, I don't want to worry about something else kind of trying to fit in there. I know what's going on. So now let's do another label, because that was actually just a little bit too simple. I like to do leading and trailing to the previous labels instead of everything out to the sides of the super view. And then they have a vertical baseline standard spacing. So normally you would just do a vertical spacing of 10 points or however far you want it. If you do that though, as the text gets bigger, that gap stays the same. And either you write code to calculate and adjust that, or you let them do it. So basically what this does is it creates a proportional leading for you. So as the font becomes larger, that space becomes larger too. And we'll have a little example of that. When you do this, it looks really tight, especially if you happen to, like me, like the frame recs in IB. So you can get really kind of uptight about how it looks like it's all going to jam up on each other, but it won't. But if your specs are for more space between it than what you end up seeing, you can adjust the multiplier, and that will increase it, and that will stay proportional as your text gets larger as well. So now we can test it. Start up the accessibility inspector. Everybody seen the accessibility inspector? It's awesome. You access it through the developer tool item, or menu item. And it always starts out looking at your laptop or your machine in general, but you choose your simulator, and whichever simulator you have open will be in that list. Then you can go to the third tab, which is the settings tab, which is really poorly named. So people tend to not look in there because they think it's the inspector's settings, but you're changing your app settings. And there's that familiar slider now. You can directly change it and slide it along, and your app should update and change size. This is one of the few times that you will need to change that the elements will change size while you're watching it. So don't get too uptight about trying to put animations and stuff on there and have a nice smooth transition, okay? That's just gonna kill a lot of effort on your part. But as you can see, as we get larger and larger, that gap is not staying constant. And it looks reasonable. And that is the 1.0 multiplier. So it's not as tight as it looked in IB. All right. So if you go to the second tab, which is the Inspect tab or Audit tab, you get the Run Audit. And you click on the Run Audit button and it says no warnings. It always says that, right? But then you go and you use somebody else's app who hasn't properly done dynamic type, and you get warnings. And you're gonna get one of these warnings for every text element that's not supporting properly. Now the good news is when you select it, it'll actually highlight that text element, so you know exactly which one it's talking about. And it will give you some information about it. And if you actually go and click the little help icon, it will give you a little bit more detail about what's going on, in case you don't remember. As I said before, there are what I'm calling text elements, which are the 3 current text elements that support dynamic type and sizing. They all kind of support it. You can always set the font on something like that, but these are the ones that will automatically update and change for you. They each have some little quirks though. The text elements, you need, as we mentioned before, you need to set the number of lines to 0. With UITextField, since it usually has like a focus ring around it, you don't necessarily want to do the baseline to baseline alignment. It's not really meant to be part of the reading flow, but it will support that, and you definitely should, because as somebody with low vision, having a hard time seeing what you're typing in is one of the bigger frustrations there is. And in UITextView, if you disable scrolling, it will automatically auto-size it. So if you're actually wanting text entry and scrolling in there, you're gonna have to kind of manage some other things on your own and look through that. But otherwise, if you're just looking for it to lay out, if you want some more complex layout with attributed strings, that's what you would use. There is one other quirk of UITextView, is that it has this content inset around it, which is 8 points at the top and 8 points at the bottom. And generally you don't notice it, but at smaller sizes, at smaller content sizes, you actually can get overlap of that, and it looks like the field before it is clipping. So one way that you can get rid of that is to change that content inset with the text container inset, set it to 0. It's not perfect yet. There's still a couple points shifted in. I don't really have a way that I like to handle that I want to recommend, but feel free to experiment. I usually just say if I'm going to use text views in something, I'll use all text views and keep them all uniform. Table views, everybody's bane, right? This you definitely need auto resizing table views and get your foo going on for that. Set the row height to automatic, estimate it as close as you can. And if you're using one of the Apple system styles, they do a pretty good job of automatically adjusting the sizes for you. But basically, nobody uses the Apple default cells anymore, right? The key to this, and I've gone back and forth, I'm not going to do a whole bunch of combinations of layout issues and stuff like that. The one thing that most people overlook on these is putting a bottom constraint in to actually say, because you're, again, defining it in terms of the size of each of these text elements, the vertical dimension, so you want the top margin defined, you want all the distances between the elements defined, and you want the bottom margin defined. And then all of the intrinsic heights of these text elements will fill that in and will basically push out your view. A lot of times we get trapped in thinking of auto layout as something that constrains to 100 points and everything needs to fit within it. This is definitely a push out thing. And it's similarly with scroll views, although more complicated. So in that, you need to make sure that your content view, your content size is fully defined by that too. Those are where you generally get into all the hairy things. One other part of it that sometimes helps is actually bumping up the compression resistance, because sometimes it'll try and shrink your text fields. Don't know why so much. So, adapting the layout. Everything is going to get bigger and bigger the older and older your audience gets, I guess. If you look at some of Apple's stuff, what they've done, they keep the same layout through the regular sizes, and then when it hits accessibility, they completely change the layout. And they go much more vertical. And there's also a little quirk where it clips the PM, which is pretty fun. But as you can see, you've gone from getting 5 entries on the screen to not even 1. And that freaks a lot of people out. It doesn't freak out the people who are using it. Okay, keep that in mind. When they first announced this, we did a UI review, and we're trying to get some advice on it at WWC. And the kind of comment that came back is, at some point, it just becomes a big watch. And it seems really silly, but it's a really good guideline. It's how much are you actually going to fit on this? You don't want to clutter it all up. You want to give the user the information that they need. So how do you change this information and adjust and adapt to it? Every UI view controller has a trait collection on it. In the trait collection is the preferred content size category. So if you need to do some calculation. The automatically adjust works most cases that I have. It doesn't when you're doing some really custom layout and such. But if you need to do something a bit more complicated or actually calculate out, even simple calculations, the way I recommend it is that you override the trait collection to change method. And that passes in the previous trait collection. So this is one of those quirky kind of things that takes a little bit of getting used to. I'm used to something to change. Here's the current value of it. Your current value is now on your viewer controller. The previous is what it's passing you here. So you can compare these values and see if you need to change anything. It gets called before a subview gets laid out, so you're free to adjust all the constraints, add and remove, that kind of thing. And it's also suitable for initial configuration. So if you have any kind of layout calculations that are based on this, do it there instead of trying to do the whole view did load or wake from nib, that kind of thing. It works great. Hey, your previous comes in as a nil, and you know it's new. There is also a notification, did change notification that you can observe. I put an asterisk next to it because I stopped using it a few versions ago because it would not actually fire in the simulator. That seems to be fixed now, but still made me nervous. But if you do have something that's not, something that needs to know about this that's not attached to a viewer view controller, that's how you would do it. So again, what do? You adjust to this. I look to Apple for guidance. They've gotten much better. They're not perfect. But like the Contacts app, you see all the action buttons at the top that once they hit a certain size, become vertical. It's something that's really nice to do with collection views or stack views. So you can just change the access and it'll work. The content size category, enum has comparison operators. So if you notice that your text gets too big at a certain size to really kind of fit in comfortably and you want to switch layouts, you can do that. Otherwise, you can actually just use the is accessibility category. It makes it easy for that, so you don't have to do a lot of comparisons. And if you will notice if you play around with Apple stuff, that is where they do a lot of their redesign breaks. Generally, the first 7 content size categories have one design that just gets bigger, and anything accessibility shifts to a more vertical that just gets bigger. There's also, at the accessibility sizes, some freebies that happen. If you long press on bar icons, on your tab bars, toolbars, navigation bar, status bar, it puts up a HUD of the contents of it. So it's one way of seeing the time. Frankly, it doesn't make the text large enough, in my opinion. But it also, if it's an icon, will scale up your icon. To look nice that way, you should ship with PDF assets and have it preserve the vector information. It is possible to also, shoot, I didn't put that in there, provide a 75 by 75 point icon and set that in code as the icon to use. But otherwise, it's going to scale up your little 23 pointer, and it's not going to look very good. And this is something that you really have no control over right now. It's there, and it's out in the wild. Also, segmented controls. Since you're only going to fit so much on, at the accessibility sizes, if you long press and hold on that, it gives you a popover of all the different elements, and they are scaled for you. So, probably the number one reason everybody's here is what about custom fonts? Apple's made it easier. I really don't think anybody should. And it's hard for me to talk about this without sounding like a opinionated jerk. But people do it anyway. So before you do this, keep some things in mind. Apple's gone to great lengths with San Francisco. If you've ever watched the font sessions where they talk about it, they do a lot of tracking. They actually change, at a certain scale, they change from a text font to a display font, so they display better. I don't think they actually change any weights necessarily, but they do a lot of tweaking on it, which is more than really anybody else's in-house designer is ever going to be able to do for their fonts at all those different scales and really know what's going on. If you have one of those people, that's amazing. But otherwise, I would rely on Apple's to do it. And the goal, again, is to maintain a consistent view across it. I realize some people have the opinion that looking like Apple's means we're not differentiating enough, but there's plenty of room for differentiation still. As well, without your developers, and probably yourself, since most of you are most likely developers, without adding a bunch of other code, almost all the system provided views, the mail composers, the alerts, share sheets, all of that stuff, basically, it comes up in the system font. It comes up scaled already. So if you're not supporting this right now, your users who are using dynamic type, if they're still using your app, are still seeing dynamic type fonts in your app, almost definitely. So by having custom fonts in there, you're still not really fitting in, and your app is still actually looking a bit inconsistent as a result. That, to me, is my biggest argument that I use whenever we want to use custom fonts. It's not like I actually win that argument very often. So, to do the custom fonts, first you package and ship your font, which I'm sure everybody else has figured out how to do, so I'm just gonna point to the Apple's documentation on it. Then what you do is you create an instance of the font that you want to use at the size that you would use for large, the default size for the style that you're going to be using. Then you create a UIFontMetrics object for that text style that you're going to assign it. And FontMetrics does magic as far as I know. But it's what attaches to the font somehow and knows how to do that ramping up in the different directions. And as far as I know, it just does a straight linear mapping of it. Pretty sure it doesn't do any of the little kerning tracking stuff for you, because that's really hard to figure out from any arbitrary font. And then you get the scaled font for your instance of the font from metrics, and you use that as the font. Now, you get to do that for every text element you want to have a custom font. So you get to figure out whether or not it's worth it. One thing I want to share, which I've been doing this for years and I had no idea, trying to figure out what font name to use when you're loading fonts has always been a crapshoot for me. And then I found out if you load it into the font book app and look at it, it tells you. if you do the inspection. It tells you which font names to use. So you don't have to worry about whether there's a space or a capitalized letter or a dash in there, or any kind of thing. So I'm helping you out there. Apple's guidance as of iOS 11 for auto layout or for dynamic type, because they definitely, as part of scaling everything, they really went whole hog into changing over their apps. And in their talks, even from 2017, 18, they say they're committed to doing it properly. Doesn't always happen, but there's a lot to change. So they want to make as much of the text dynamic as possible. Yes. Again, I guess there are probably pieces of text that you would find that are decoration instead of information. Okay. You can use those. You can keep those. And use as much of the screen width. Once you narrow it down and the text gets large, you get parts of words. There's not much reading. It's very choppy. So use as much screen width as possible. And wrap, don't truncate. Especially in prior to iOS 11, most of the default behaviors were just to have a single line of label, and hey, you just truncate it, and now you get to only read the first word of whatever that was there. But they want to have you displaying the same amount of text as the default UI. And again, this is, you let it go and let it, oh, I'm not going there. Having that range of 5 calendar dates to not even 1 is something just to accept and not fight. I have a picture of music from iOS 9. Remember when they all went to everything translucent and layered and really poorly contrasty? And that is what it looked like at the larger font sizes as well. It didn't change. And then everything went white, right? And at first it was, oh great, they're going through another style change and everything. And the more I look at it, and especially in light of dynamic type, the more Apple's apps look like they're just intentionally redesigned to fit dynamic type and to be more legible. They've gotten rid of a lot of the translucency stuff. It's nice and clear and crisp, and it scales for the things that matter. How much is long in this song? How much is left in this song? Where are my controls? The stuff that I want to use when I'm driving and it's sitting on the mount and playing some music. I chose as an example this little conversation from my friend Mike Hay that was on Tweetbot, and I don't want to call it Tweetbot as doing anything wrong. It's just very conveniently had 2 tweets that were laid out differently in the conversation, which is a little quirk that they do. But the main tweet that you're looking at has full width. It's changed that layout so it's full width. Most other Twitter apps and stuff, and even Tweetbot itself, has this gutter with the avatar in it, which ends up at larger font sizes being a big waste of space. I wouldn't have to worry about scrolling everything down so much if I could actually just spread out and use that space, which looks a lot better when you have it laid out like that. And there's still layout quirks in there. You'll notice some things truncated accidentally. There's always room for layout improvements when it comes to this, because it does add complexity. So the number 1 rule, and the number 1 thing that's going to make it really tough on you to retrofit any of your apps, is that everything needs to scroll. You need to assume that at some point it's going to have to scroll. It's not going to fit on the screen. So many apps these days are designed to be pixel perfect, single screen kind of things, and that just doesn't work when you have to make your text bigger. But it's not the easiest thing to do, and it's not an easy thing to do shipping 1 view controller at a time either. It's kind of an all or nothing. So it takes some commitment. But when you're looking at using an iPhone with Apple's apps at the default sizes, and your app fits in okay, and then the user has larger sizes, and you don't look so good anymore, the user's going to have a hard time reading it. And then when you get really big, your app is pretty much unusable. So following along, fitting in, helps to adopt your app. The iPhone frame is really beautiful, but it's not to frame a piece of art that doesn't change and doesn't have any content outside of its bounds. Your app isn't really, okay, no slight on you, your app's not a piece of art. It's more like a novel that you can let people read in any size, any device, okay? These are some really great videos. I'll get around to posting out the slides as well, so you shouldn't have to write these down. But you'll notice this burst of 2013, introducing TextKit and using fonts. 2017 had some dynamic type stuff, and 2018 is where they really started committing to this stuff. So that's it. Any questions?
Okay, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Okay.
Yeah, I was curious, do you have any specific advice for working with collection views as opposed to table views?
I do not. I've heard nightmares about it. I've heard that as long as, there are some sessions about collection views, and especially flow layout, that considering in the apps I've worked on, I haven't really done many collection views, which is why it would all be academic. Watching the videos kind of melts my brain of the stuff that they say you have to do, and I'm not really sure why they're doing that. It seems a little bit kind of overkill. I have friends who are constantly cursing collection view, frankly, but they're also not using a flow layout, and so that seems to add a lot of complexity to it. So,
Thanks.
I wish I did.
With the push to make dynamic type the norm, have you heard anything about them making it the default? The setting in IB, for instance? Or is there any way to make it a default?
I have not heard anything. I have also, frankly, not had time to focus on any sessions this year yet. Just a little bit, barely. It would be nice. And the only way that I know of that you could do that is just to basically create your own custom subclasses and use those everywhere that automatically set themselves up. There was a question.
Oh, okay.
So I have worked with dynamic type in one app. It was actually a chat. And we had tons of problems with the designer because he wanted to use bold fonts or medium and other weights. Mm-hmm. And it looked like it was something that you have to follow the typography page from Apple. And we actually had a different font, not San Francisco. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it is the custom font or it is a real problem.
Yeah, the default text styles don't provide a lot of subtle variations. So it's generally bolder, plain. And if you want stuff like italic and that, you can do that with some extra work. And what you want to do is look into font descriptors, where you can basically get the preferred font, you can get its font descriptor, you can tweak its symbolic traits to certain things, and then get a new font based on that, and use that. This is stuff I always wanted to get into the talk, but then it just gets too deep in the weeds. Which does bring up a thing is, I am hoping to release some of the experimental stuff that I'm doing to kind of show, a little bit tutorial-ish, and keep a conversation going. Anybody has tips of their own, I'd love to hear them, and I will share them out because I want this to happen. So I'm planning on working some more, and that kind of thing is something I'm hoping to talk about, is those kinds of techniques that just were a bit too big to fit into all of this. Any other questions? Cool.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Paul.
Yep. Thanks.